Good evening, everyone. My name is Catherine Stager, and I'm the Director of Producer Communications and Influencer Outreach with New York Beef Council. I also serve as the co-coordinator of the Beef Quality Assurance Program here in New York with Dr. Mike Baker and Nancy Glazier of Cornell. We are very excited to offer this series of webinars as recertification credits for those of you who are looking for continued education to build off of your beef quality assurance certification. Or you might also be in need of this recertification qualifications if it's been 3 years since the last time you either became certified or recertified. So we want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us this evening. We are really looking forward to our presentation from Dr. Rob Lynch, who is a DVM and also dairy herd health and management specialist with Pro Dairy at Cornell. We're also going to hear from Dr. Dave, who is a retired veterinarian and has had a long career as a veterinarian both here in New York State and also with some larger scale ranches and feedlots out in the West. So we are looking forward to the discussion this evening, and we really encourage you all to interact and ask any questions that you may have about examining the effectiveness of your vaccinations. So with that, I will turn things over to Rob Lynch to get us kicked off.
So I feel like I really like this topic. It's hard to think of a more significant medical achievement in modern history than our ability to create vaccines to protect us from disease. And the race is on right now to develop this COVID vaccine, and so we're all quite aware of how immune enhancement really can improve the health of us and how it can improve the health of our herds. So I'm going to go over some basic vaccine stuff, some basic immunology, and then I'll turn things over to Dr. Wilson, where he can get into some specifics on the diseases that we're most concerned with and how we develop programs to keep our herds healthy. So in general, and I'm a pretty visual person, so I like to make graphics to kind of make sure I'm making a point here, but we like to try to keep our immune system higher than the disease challenge that we're faced with. Whatever the disease is, it really doesn't matter, but if we keep our general immune level above the challenge, we stay healthy. But sometimes things go awry, and we get too much disease in around us, and so our immune system didn't change, but we just got overwhelmed with too much pathogen, too much disease. And so someone with a cold gets in your car and you give them a ride somewhere, chances are you're just going to see too much of that cold virus, and you're going to get sick even though your immune system didn't change. Same is true with our cattle. You get a calf calf's born in the mud, takes a big manure meal, and just too much bacteria gets to that calf at one time, and even though the immune system is what it is, was too much disease to fend it off. The opposite can happen, where the disease level didn't change. The disease was present all along, but our immune system just got weakened, and maybe we got stressed, and maybe we got overtired. Something suppressed our overall immune function, and the disease that was there all along, and we weren't getting sick, but when we weakened our immune system, it got below our level to fight off that challenge. And so I think of a calf that just didn't get on mom and didn't drink enough colostrum, didn't get that immune protection right away. Otherwise a clean pasture, but still enough disease was there that with a weakened immune system, that calf ends up getting scours, getting sick. Then we have like a double whammy. Think of your transported cattle coming off a trailer. They were stressed from the transport, and they were probably packed in with some other sick calves, and had both an immune suppression and overwhelming disease challenge, and would break with shipping fever. So in order to keep the herd healthy, what we try to do when we're coming up with vaccination programs and just good management practices in general, we're trying to heighten the level of immune function, non-specifically with just good nutrition and good management, and specifically with targeted immunizations, vaccinations. At the same time, we're trying to lower that overall disease prevalence. And so by just good hygiene practices and good biosecurity, we can try to keep those diseases as low as possible. And so it's that spread, that difference between a strong immune system and a minimal disease challenge. That's what I think of a herd health program. And working with your veterinarian on how do we minimize exposure to disease and how do we maximize immune function is really what it takes to keep a herd healthy. So a quick primer on immunology. This is, we could take, years and years of college to try to understand the immune system, and I'm going to wrap it up in 2 slides. But basically, immunity is an ability to resist a disease challenge, and that could be natural. Once we get a disease, we tend to not get it again, or acquired. We can prime the immune system with things like vaccines to build that resistance to a specific disease challenge prior to when the animals are going to see it. And so you can think of the immune system kind of like a military. I could break it up into a few pieces just to help us better understand it. And the first branch in that is this an innate immunity, non-specific immunity, or is this acquired or targeted immune protection? The innate immune system, it may surprise some of you, starts with like the physical barriers, like an intact skin or intact hide keeps a lot of disease out. A low pH in the abomasum of the cow kills a lot of bacteria. So there are barriers to keeping disease out, and they really probably do more protection for our animals than anything else. And then we have some non-specific immune functions. Doesn't really care what the pathogen is. It just knows it's not supposed to be there, and it starts fighting off that disease in a non-specific manner. And then we have the white cells, which are very much involved in the acquired immune system, but they start with not really knowing what that pathogen is. Neutrophils and macrophages, they don't even necessarily initially need to know what the pathogen is to know that it's foreign, and they start trying to kill those invaders as they come in. Then the other part of the immune system is the adaptive immunity. We can break that up into another couple of pieces. We've got the humoral branch of the immune system, and those are our B cells, and B cells make antibodies. And we hear a lot about antibodies, and so it's these B cells that generate specific antibodies which bind to the specific pathogen they were generated for. That could be a virus, it could be a bacteria, it could be a parasite, but it's very targeted to a very specific pathogen. And they accelerate our immune system's ability to clear that pathogen at the time that the initial exposure takes place. And then it sets aside a little bit of memory, a few memory cells, which are already geared towards that pathogen. And they hang out and they remember what that pathogen was like to help us remember the next time we see that pathogen, we can fight it much more efficiently with these memory cells. The other part of this is the cell-mediated branch of the immune system. Those are our T cells. And they have a bunch of different functions, but these are the T cells are responsible for that first specific immune reaction to a virus or a bacteria. These cells are what's necessary for fighting off organisms that are intracellular, that live inside our cells, either respiratory cells or intestinal lining cells or any cells. These viruses tend to replicate inside the cells, and antibodies don't do a great job of attacking those, but our T cells do. So they attack the cells that have been invaded by things like viruses. T cells also generate memory, just like our B cells. We have these memory cells that get set aside to help us respond to this disease if we ever see it again. Cell-mediated immunity is difficult to measure, and so I'll just mention that because when you read about vaccine trials and things, you tend to read a lot about titers, and those are antibodies, and that's just because it's a pretty convenient marker of an immune response, but we're not really measuring the cell-mediated branch very efficiently. It's just because it's hard to do. Hard to do well and hard to do cost effectively. We also have a localized immunity to think about. Basically, anywhere where we think an invasion might take place, so inside our upper airways, inside the gut lining, places where bacteria and viruses may invade, we tend to build up immune function in those areas. And so we'll call that a localized immunity. And these things do not work in isolation. They all interact, they all communicate. The B cells and the T cells and our localized immune system all function together to generate an immune response and fight off disease. So the immune response, or the anamnestic response, graphically kind of looks like this. We have our immune system is plugging along, and then we are exposed to a disease we've never seen before. And our immune system ramps up and it responds to that challenge. It sees the antigen, it makes more of itself specific to the disease, and it fends it off. Meanwhile, while it works, and this takes a couple weeks, we may get sick. We actually caught the disease and our immune system responded to it, and we finally got over it, hopefully, but we definitely got sick in the process. But we get over that initial exposure and we see that disease again sometime in the near future. Our immune system is primed. It's ready to, it knows this enemy. It knows it well. And so it responds in a robust, overwhelming fashion. It responds so well, we probably don't even realize we were exposed to that virus or that bacteria again. Never got sick. And that's, we can attribute that to the memory cells, that memory that our immune system set aside the first time it saw it. And that first exposure is really what we're doing with vaccines. We're creating that initial immune response without all the nasty side effects. We don't get sick, our animals don't get sick when we give them the vaccine, but they see enough of this pathogen to generate memory, to remember, should they ever see this disease later on, they'll already have the memory cells ready to kind of give this second wave response without any of the nasty effects of that initial exposure. And I just wanted to highlight the difference between vaccination and immunization. We can give vaccines all day long, but if we don't elicit this immune response, this anamnestic response, and create memory, we're really doing nothing. We're doing nothing but spending money on vaccine and giving shots. So we really want to make sure when we're doing this, we are eliciting the immune response that we're counting on by giving these vaccines. There are a lot of things that can gum up the works and minimize an animal's immune function. And I just kind of put some general categories here, and you're probably well aware of all these, but good nutrition, safe environment, comfortable environment, animals that are diseased with other things like Johne's disease or BVD, heavily parasitized animals, stressed, overcrowded animals, animals that have had various management things done where we just know it's stressful on them, like castrating and dehorning and moving them around and weaning. Animals that are just born and animals that give birth both go through an immune suppression event. And so we know all of these things have an impact on general immune function. We manage the ones we can manage, and some of those we can't really manage around. We just kind of know it's a time when the immune function is a little bit suppressed. So now I'm going to get into the products, like the various options we have commercially for giving immune enhancing products to our animals. And I'll start by just a quick mention of enhancers. Those things aren't, they're not vaccines, they're not antibodies, they're just things that are supposed to generally promote good immune function. Those could be micro minerals, they could be vitamins, but they have claims of enhancing health and immune function, but really aren't eliciting an immune response. It's just covering our bases nutritionally more than anything else. And then we can look into generating either passive immunity or active immunity. And I'm going to get into the differences, what's different between a passive immune product versus an active immune product. And amongst the active immune products, then we get into our class, like what you think of when you think of vaccines. Is it killed, modified live? Is it a bacterium? Is it a toxin or a toxoid? So first thing is just this, making the difference between passive and active immunity. Passive immunity is just as it's described, it's passive. The animal doesn't have to do anything to generate some protection from it. We're basically giving antibodies to the animal to provide some immediate protection. So as soon as those antibodies are on board and in the circulation, they are immediately starting to work. So this is, if you need protection like now, you need it like right away. An unvaccinated animal, we're gonna castrate. Maybe we want to put some protection on board right away. You're going to reach for an antibody preparation because you need that right away. You don't have time to wait for the animal to mount an immune response. Unfortunately, they only live as long as the antibodies stick around, and so these antitoxins tend to be a pretty short-lived period of protection. We're talking days, maybe weeks. And there is no memory generated because the immune system's not responding to it. We're not creating that long-term memory response that we get from our vaccines. Antitoxins tend to be rather reactive, so we don't want to rely on them if we don't have to. So anaphylactic type reactions, injection swellings, antitoxins are a little notorious for that happening a little more often. So examples of this would be like first offense, calf scour boluses that we give to calves right after they're born. Tetanus antitoxin preparations are all basically antibodies to those toxins and to those pathogens. So that's passive immunity. Active immunity is vaccines. It takes a while for a vaccine to work. So I put on here delayed because we're talking a minimum of 2 to probably more like 3 weeks for some of our vaccines to elicit any level of protection to our animals. So if you need that protection right now, vaccine's not gonna do it for you. If used correctly, these vaccines tend to generate a pretty good long-lived immune protection window, a lot longer than you would get from like an antibody preparation. Because we're generating memory, and that should last us quite a while. We're talking in the neighborhood of, year to years maybe. And then the categories of these active immune products would fall under what you're consider as your classic vaccines: killed vaccines, modified live vaccines, bacterians, and toxoids. So amongst the killed vaccines, or we'll call them inactivated vaccines, basically it's the pathogen that we're worried about, virus or a bacteria, and it's killed. It's broken up, and what we're presenting to the animal are parts of those killed organisms, or parts of the toxin that normally makes the animal sick, the toxin that's released by some bacterial pathogens. And so it's just parts of those pathogens, and therefore it's not going to get into the animal, it's not going to grow, it's not going to replicate, but it's still providing kind of the fingerprint of what the pathogen has from an antigen standpoint. It gives the animal a chance to see those antigens and mount an immune response to them. Now, instead of inactivated, we've got attenuated or modified live vaccines. And those are altered or mutated viruses or bacteria. And they're mutated and altered far enough away from the original pathogen so that they no longer cause disease. They don't exhibit the behavior of the diseases that they've been modified from. The vaccine companies also have to demonstrate stability. So not only have they kind of mutated away from a pathogenic state, they are not unstable, so they're not going to revert back to a virulent state once they start replicating again. So we prove that they're not going to cause harm, and we prove that the genome is stable. And so these become our seed stock for live virus and live bacterial vaccines. These things, they are an organism. So when we administer a modified live vaccine, we expect those organisms to get into the tissues, to replicate, to behave in a lot of ways like the pathogen would without causing illness. And that just presents antigen to the white cells, to the macrophages, to the neutrophils. It presents itself to the immune system in a way that's very similar to what the pathogen would. So it gives the immune system a really good look at what this thing looks like. And we're able to mount a really nice, robust immune response that way because it just looks just like the real thing. I wanted to comment quickly on adjuvants. You'll find that most of your killed vaccines and even some of your live vaccines have these adjuvants included in them to enhance the immune response. And so basically adjuvants are just irritants. They're chemical irritants, and they're meant to stimulate the immune system in a non-specific manner to enhance an immune response of the vaccine that's given at the same time. And we'll call it an immune booster. And so you think of those booster rockets on the space shuttles when they go up into space. Those booster rockets, they're just helping getting the job done. They're not really part of the specific immune response. They're just giving a general reactivity to the immune system. An example of an adjuvant would be aluminum hydroxide, and most of the vaccine companies have some proprietary adjuvants that they will include in their products. But that's what an adjuvant is. So some pros and cons between your modified lives and your killed virus vaccines. So modified lives, on the plus side, like I mentioned, you get a really good immune response to these. Typically, you tend to get some response off of just one injection. So technically, there's no booster necessary. We'll get into some differences as far as revaccination times, but it's not technically a booster at that point. So we can get some protection off the first shot. They're a little less reactive because we don't have to rely as heavily on adjuvants. And on a cost per dose standpoint, they tend to be a little cheaper as long as you can use all your doses. The cons, it's not safe in all animals, so we have to read those labels carefully and make sure that we're not accidentally giving it to animals that it's not safe to be given in. Like some can't be used in pregnant cows, and just make sure you're giving it to the animals that it's safe to be used in. These products are very fragile, so once they're reconstituted, they got to be used up within a few hours. So it's not like we can just tuck that away in the refrigerator and use it again next week. We got to use them up after we mix them. And we have to handle these products carefully. We can very easily kill the live products that are in there if we expose it to sun or let it get warm, things like that. We can really wreck these vaccines pretty easily. Killed virus vaccines, so pros and cons again. Very few unused doses because these things can stick around in the fridge for a lot longer than a modified live reconstituted vaccine. Check your labels though. A lot of those have a broach vial statement on them that say, hey, once you start dipping into this bottle, once you start taking doses out, you got to use this stuff up. So, and also you can wreck a killed vaccine too if you're not careful with, introducing bacteria and potentially blood products and things. You can ruin these vaccines too. They tend to have a pretty wide usage as far as safety goes. They can go in all classes of animals, but again, check your labels, make sure it's age appropriate and that you're giving it to the animals that it's safe to be used in. A lot of convenience to these products because of their long life in the refrigerator. The cons, because of those adjuvant systems, these tend to be a little more reactive than our live vaccines. They tend to elicit a somewhat narrower immune response, but we can talk a little bit when we get into programs about how we partner these things up with modified live programs. They almost always require a booster. That first time an animal sees this vaccine, it's going to have to get another one within a few weeks. And if that doesn't happen, we will not generate memory. We will not have that immune response. So that one shot is really just a waste. They tend to be a little more expensive to make, so they tend to be a little more expensive to sell on a per dose basis, but you tend to have fewer wasted doses because you just have more time to use them. There's a class of vaccines out now called intranasals, and so these vaccines tend to target the mucosal immunity, and what we're doing is we're delivering antigen by the route that the pathogen is most likely to take. And so if we're trying to protect our animals from a respiratory virus that's likely inhaled, it's nice to be able to deliver the antigen that way, because we're going to deliver the antigen to the immune cells that are most likely going to respond to the real thing. And so we've got dendritic cells that are spread out throughout the upper airways, and they'll see those antigens coming in from the vaccine and very efficiently drive an immune response specific to that pathogen. And it also drives where the immune system goes. It's like a GPS for all the immune cells. It will say, hey, this is a respiratory pathogen, so we need the immune system to come to the respiratory, or come to the respiratory system to elicit the best effect. So it doesn't get lost, circulating around the body. Mucosal immune stimulation tends to be a little less suppressed by mom's antibodies. And so when we're vaccinating young calves, mom's antibodies sometimes just get in the way of a calf responding to a good parenterally or, IM or sub-Q administered vaccine. But if we can deliver our antigens, and they must be labeled to go intranasally, but if we can go with an intranasal respiratory vaccine, we can get around that maternal antibody interference a little bit. And so she's more likely to respond to our vaccine that way. Briefly, there are autogenous vaccines that can be made. And just a quick note on these, they are created from the diseases on the farm of interest. And so if you got a virus or a bacteria from a deceased animal or collected from a sick animal, those can be turned into an autogenous vaccine to meet some unmet needs for the farm. If there's a lack of a commercially available vaccine that will provide protection for the herd, that's where autogenous vaccines can fit in. But there's very limited or really no efficacy studies done on specifically generated autogenous vaccines, and also no safety trials done either. So in principle, that those efficacy and safety data is there, but specifically for the one you're making, we really don't know. So it's kind of really, it's a stopgap measure to cover for some emerging needs that commercially available products aren't currently meeting. And then Scour's vaccines are kind of unique, and I know they're real popular for given to our pregnant cows. And so I thought I'd just comment quickly on how these work, or how long they take to work. But a Scour's vaccine is just, we're stimulating the immune system of the cow. She makes antibodies, and then those antibodies will migrate from her bloodstream into her mammary gland. And that happens 5-6 weeks prior to calving. So it starts long before she gives birth. And so when we're thinking about giving a Scour's vaccine, we gotta think way ahead. First off, if she's never seen this vaccine before, it's killed, so she's got to have it twice. And so we're thinking 6 to 16 weeks, depending on your vaccine label, prior to when we expect her to calve. We're starting our vaccine way back then. And then we're gonna go and give a booster to that animal 3, 4, 6 weeks. Again, it depends on your vaccine, after the first shot. And that all should be happening so she has time to make those antibodies and then get them into her mammary gland. So she's going to respond to the vaccine, make antibodies specific to those Scour's pathogens. She starts moving those antibodies into her mammary gland about 5 or 6 weeks before calving. That calf's got a nurse on the cow to get those antibodies. And in the dairy world, where I spend my time mostly, we have to actually deliver those antibodies, because we don't let the calf do it on her own. If they've had the vaccine in prior years, then it's just an annual, again, about 3 to 6 weeks prior to calving, depending on your vaccine product, you would give that booster shot to remind her immune system to make more antibodies again before next calving. Vaccine inserts, the print is terribly small, very difficult to read, but that's where all your information is that you need on this. It tells you who can get it, what age is it safe in, is it safe in a pregnant animal, how do you give it, where do you give it, how often do you give it, how do you store it, when's it gonna, all that information is clearly printed on these labels. It's just, they just have to put it in a really small package, so the type is quite small.
Hey Rob, we have a question about
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on one-shot vaccines for those animals being sold as stalkers?
So the commercial one shot, or just giving one shot of any old vaccine, like it kind of depends. Like a one shot is, you can give that once and will elicit an immune response. But you have to check your label. If it says you need to give a booster after you give this vaccine, then it means you got to give a booster. And if it says you really only have to give it once, then you only have to give it once.
The clarification was one shot of all the vaccines they would theoretically need.
Yeah, so same thing goes. If they've never seen it before, and some of those vaccines require a booster, then they definitely have to have a booster of that vaccine. So if you're given a mixture of, maybe I've got 3 different vaccines I want to give these cows. One of them is a modified live and the other are killed. The modified live likely only needs one injection, but those killed vaccines, without seeing the label, I can't say for sure, but almost positive require a booster if they've never seen it before.
And
So,
we have one more question for right now, when going back to your scours vaccine slide, and Dave might want to chime in as well, is which is better, the scours vaccine or first response for the calf after it is born?
yeah, so that's the, let me see if I can click on that slide. Yeah, so that's kind of the age-old question. It's nice to get it in the cow, because then the calf's just going to eat those antibodies when she gets on the cow. And she's also getting all the other antibodies that mom's generating. If I'm not sure if that calf really got a good drink, then those antibody products that we give right to the calf can really help. And so sometimes it's just a kind of an insurance policy. I'm going to give some of these antibodies to the calf too, just in case she didn't get enough. I don't know if Dave want to add anything to that.
Well, sometimes the commercial products have to be administered prior to the calf nursing, and that can be a challenge if you go to bed at a decent hour and you get up next morning and there's Junior. You don't know if he's nursed or not. A lot of times, so preference is to let the cows take care of the immunization, just like Rob was saying. You vaccinate them early enough so that they can produce antibodies, and the calves need to suckle to get the colostrum within that first really 12, 18 hours maximum since it was born, just because of gut closure. It's where the body starts becoming less effective at absorbing the maternal antibodies that way. So what works best for your management system is what it breaks down. If you're kind of like Mike Baker and all your cows are crazy and will grind you up at birth when you're trying to tag a calf, you probably don't want to be down there trying to poke a bolus down its throat.
Good points. So kind of wrapping up here before I turn things over to Dave. When you're thinking about implementing a vaccine protocol, I like to just, in general, like to start with a risk assessment. So what are the diseases we're worried about with my herd? What are our handling opportunities for administering vaccines or other things to my herd? What kind of market am I after? Like, there are probably some preconditioning requirements that will, make things go better for you in the market. And so you're considering all those factors. Don't overlook the facilities and your help. We can build a really complicated vaccination protocol, but we can make it really hard for you to get done in a way that's going to be consistent. So, we're building our programs to make sure that they can be done efficiently and consistently. And then we start picking our vaccines. I like to look at, what kind of efficacy data is here. What's the safety profile of this vaccine? What is it safe to go into this class of animal? What's my timing intervals? Like, when do I have to give this vaccine, and when should I think about giving it again? Again, that's all going to be in your vaccine inserts, and you can talk to your veterinarian on those specific timings. Which one's giving me the coolest hat? Which one am I getting the best rebate on? Those things weigh in there somewhere, but it's definitely lower on the list than on these initial selection pieces. I've run into quite a few issues around vaccine handling. And so I thought I'd just wrap up my part with some things I've run into. We run into a lot of just poorly stored vaccines, spend a lot of money on these vaccines, and we tend to load up the fridge. But is that refrigerator actually functioning? Is the refrigerator outdoors and it's the dead of winter in upstate New York, and everything inside it freezes? That's not good for our vaccines. Leaving vaccines in the door of your refrigerator, they're convenient because the pockets are small, but the door is where we see the most temperature fluctuations when we're reaching in there for getting things in and out of there. Our dairies like to put big buckets of colostrum in their refrigerator. I hope that's not also where the vaccine's being stored, because 102-degree 5-gallon bucket of milk is really going to wreak havoc on the temperature inside that refrigerator. They make really cheap, handy meters, thermometers that can go inside your refrigerator that will record what was the lowest this thing ever got, what was the highest temperature this thing ever saw since the last time I reset my thermometer. And that'll tell you, are my vaccines getting damaged while they're in my refrigerator? I mentioned this earlier, but we run into a lot of vaccine protocols where something that requires a booster and those animals aren't being given the booster. And so that vaccine is not going to elicit the response we want. Leaving live products out in the sun, letting them get warm, will really kill those vaccines real quick. Vaccinating animals in the high heat, high humidity, that's pretty stressful on them. And so we increase our likelihood of animals reacting to those vaccines if we're vaccinating them in the heat of the day. Wrong needles, wrong route, dirty, dull needles, all these things are going to lead to some injection issues at the least. And so that's all I had put together, and I'll turn things over to Dave. Dave, I apologize, I went over on my time a little bit, but.
Well, thank you very much, Rob. Unfortunately, it looks like Dave might have lost connection really quick.
Okay.
And here he comes back. So good, perfect timing. Any questions for Rob before we move on as we get Dave reconnected here? You back, Dave?
Yes.
Okay, great. And I will turn things over to Mike Baker. If you want to finish sharing your screen, Rob, then
Yep.
Mike should be able to get his up there. Perfect. Can you see that, Dave?
Yes. Okay.
Yep.
So first off, this is my first webinar as far as being one of the presenters. Typically, I like to do this in person. Much better at looking at the audience and interacting that way. So thank you all for allowing me the opportunity to broaden my technology skills. So as Dr. Rob was talking about, there's lots of different avenues for vaccines to be utilized. And so how are we going to take all that wonderful information that Rob just gave us and apply it? What's the nuts and bolts? How can we go about doing this? And one of the slides I thought was really instrumental for Rob's point of view was on, you spend a lot of money on a vaccine, and where do you store it? Well, everybody goes, well, you store it in a refrigerator. Well, that's great and wonderful, but you don't take the refrigerator with you to the working facilities. And so handling vaccine is also of crucial importance. Not necessarily leave it on the dashboard of the pickup truck. In the wintertime, if it's freezing outside, you don't want to leave it up there for the defroster to keep it thawed as well either. But just small little things like that. Rob was talking about items that suppress the immune system. And stress is one. It's one of the biggest factors, especially with cattle. And there were some studies done that show that whether you loaded cattle up in a trailer and hauled them 2 miles or 200 miles, they're stressed. So our rule of thumb had been 2 minutes or 2 miles. Doesn't matter. That's enough to stress a cattle so that the immune system stands a good chance of being compromised. We all have cattle that are a little bit on the flighty side, easily excited, vocalize in the chute. When you turn them loose, they just run for the hills. And you're thinking, boy, I'm glad we finally got her through the chute. But you start going, what we just did, is that going to work? So a lot of the vaccine products say one-time vaccination, and they're golden, they're good. And if you start delving in and reading the fine print on it, that one trip through covers about 80 to 85% of the animals. Meaning if we run 100 through the chute and we vaccinate them, 80 to 85 are going to respond. Unfortunately, we do not know the 15 that do not respond. So that's why it's a good idea to wait that 3-4 week interval, run everybody back through the chute to booster them. Now, this time of year, folks are going, well, we're looking at weaning calves. And so what's our biggest disease problem that we're going to have? And it's typically respiratory. It's pneumonia. This summer, where we are, has been kind of really droughty. And we've had a few calves with what I'd call like a summer pneumonia, dust pneumonia. Not real, what I'd call a horrible disease, infectious outbreak, but just from the dryness, the dust, getting down into the trachea, interfering with the body's immune system, to interfere with it, getting rid of the phlegm out of the lungs on these calves. They kind of get to where they're snotty nose, a little droopy headed, temperature sort of maybe a degree high because I had to chase them to catch their temperature. But heading into the fall, when they get weaned, commingled with other calves, the respiratory is a big issue. You start polling feed yards and you ask them what's the number one issue they have, and they're going to tell you respiratory. If you sift through all the data that's available, most producers say by far and away respiratory is a major driver. And so we can kind of start there and saying, well, our cows are already hopefully bred back. Haven't had enough time to preg check them just yet, or are you going to wait for like a fall run or something? So you're looking at going, well, we got to wean calves here pretty quick. And so the idea would be, let's run everybody through and give them their first round of vaccine. Because Dr. Rob just said they're probably going to need to have a booster. And whether you're using the modified lives or the killed, what's applicable to your operation, you're still going to have to get the cattle in and sort the cows from the calves. And that's going to be a stressor. And we're going to push the calves through the chute, probably the first time they've gone through the chute, and that's a stressor. They're going to get poked and prodded, and then turned loose. So it gets back to that thing of, the low stress management system that will definitely help with helping the vaccines become effective, meaning that the calves will respond because they're not as stressed. So as you see on the screen in front of you, we've got, it's a health management protocol that I asked Dr. Mike to put up. So it just kind of breaks down the diseases, and there are some vaccines for each and every one of them. And there's a whole host of things listed. On our operation, what we're concerned about are basically the reproductive and respiratory. And so that just two broad groups that we look into for vaccination protection. And through the virals, the reproduction and respiratory would be the IBR and BVD. They both can cause pneumonias. They both can cause abortions. BVD can cause lots of things. And then just a straight respiratory would be the PI3 and the BRSV. Now, there is some research showing that some of these vaccines, if you're using a modified live, you want to give them to a cow roughly 30, 60 days prior to breeding so that you won't cause an abortion. And the abortion is basically that the virus would replicate down around the ovary, maybe dissolve the CL and lose the calf that way. If you're looking for a bacterial problem for respiratory, well, then everybody knows about Pastorella, Mannheimia hemolytica, and what it can cause is just a straight overload in the lungs itself. It doesn't go anywhere else. That's one of the bacterians that Dr. Rob talked about. And so those are the two big items that we really focus on, especially for cows or calves that we're going to run through a preconditioned cell. We'll also give everybody a clostridial or a blackleg. That's cows and calves both. It's a very economical product. And I have seen cows with black leg as well as some of the other clostridial issues. Now, the feed yards really like to see the calves vaccinated in on the respiratory issues. Another one of the bactrians for that would be Haemophilus, or H. somnus, as everybody refers to it. And that can also cause some decent problems. Now, a lot of these vaccines can be bundled. And if you start looking at it, there are as many different combinations out there as there are diseases. And so that's one of the things that when we start looking at a BQA point of view is to, one, give as few injections as possible, and two, use as small a needle as possible, and three, you want to go sub-Q. So those are just some ideas to keep in the back of your mind as you're going through the list with your veterinarian. Now, my preference is to use the modified lives. I've had great luck with that product, that type of vaccine. And the killed lines, they do have their place. So as we take the calves in, we've got them sorted from their dams, and the cows received a killed vaccine in the spring as a pre-breeding shot, and we're wanting to vaccinate the calves. If you read the labels on most of the modified live vaccine products, they'll have a little warning in there saying, do not administer to pregnant cows that have never seen this product before prior to breeding, and please don't use in nursing calves to these cows. Now, there's way back when all this started, there was some concern about calves shedding the viruses that would be picked up by the cows, their dams, and if they were pregnant, they'd slip a calf. I've seen a lot of studies done on clinical trials to where the pharmaceutical companies administered 10 times the normal dose to a calf of a vaccine. So instead of getting 2 cc's, it would be a factor of 10, not necessarily give them a 20 cc dose of vaccine, but amplifying the virus particle load that's presented to the immune system, just to see if the calf would start shedding that virus. And Dr. Rob can chime in because he's more current on this stuff than I am, but there's very little shedding going on. Now, all that to say that there could be, due to stress, due to some management issues, etc. So my advice is, if their current cows got a killed vaccine as pre-breeding, do a killed vaccine to the calf for their first precondition vaccination. Running the risk of an abortion is not worth it. Now, your veterinarian will know your operation a lot better, and he or she can give you detailed advice on that. So now we're going to mix everybody back up. Some people, the cows for another couple of weeks, run them back through the chute. Others, like myself, I prefer to wait 30 days, wean the calves, give them about a week, then booster the vaccine. Because I want those calves, because weaning is going to be a stressor, whether you do a fence line or a hard pin weaning method, it's still going to be a stress. And we want those calves to get over that before we booster them. And so that way we're just trying to get that calf's immune system to actually work the best it possibly can. Now, also on the slide from Mike, that there's a disease called leptospirosis, and that's a reproductive issue. Now, in New York State, there's an abundance of deer, and they shed lepto. Mice and rats shed lepto. There's some wildlife that shed it. It's kind of a hardy bug. Unfortunately, the vaccines are only going to keep the immune system stimulated for about 4 to 6 months. Um, so it's one of those things that if you've got a known problem with it, especially folks who use an active bull power for their breed instead of AI, that's a good conversation to have with your veterinarian for it all. So what we can do is we can start all over again. We've got this calf, he's weaned, he's off to the sale, you're a happy producer. And come January, you start thinking about calving. And that's when because you're going to calve in March. So you need to start thinking about your scour guard uh, protection or prevention and doing that vaccine. The cows will calve in March. And you're going, well, everybody talks about the modified live. I'd like to shift over to that so that I can give that product any time during the pregnancy. And as long as you can get that into the cow, I'd say get it in there twice. Anytime it's 4 weeks after she calves, you can get the first round to them. But that last round needs to be into them, 30 days would be pushing it, maybe 42 days prior to breeding, just to kind of make sure you're covering the bases. Now, when you get to the summertime, you start looking at like the pink eye vaccines and things like that. Administering those to pregnant cows is not an issue for it. You can get that to the calves as well. Calves that hit the ground, you can give the intranasal product to. If you're calving, say, late spring, it's kind of wet, it's damp, it's miserable, still chill, and you want to kind of prime the immune system. The intranasals work great that way. Also through the summer if you're worried about pink eye, you can still slip that into a baby calf as well. That'll help. If you're banding calves at birth using, like the little green and elastrator bands, if you can get those guys banded within a day or 3, maybe 10 days of age, one, the bands will work, and 2, you don't have to worry too much about a tetanus as long as you're out on clean pasture. Some folks like to take care of the castration at weaning, and if you're doing that, that's wonderful. If you're going to band them, the day that you start your preconditioning vaccine is the day that you could administer a tetanus product to those calves, and then booster that again a week, 10 days post-weaning. So that's just an easy way to slip into the modified live program. If you're using killed and having great success with it, that's wonderful. The killed product is safe for any stage of gestation and reproductive herd. It's safe for calves, nursing those cows. It's wonderful. But just like Rob says, once you put a needle through that rubber stopper, you roughly got about 10 days, rule of thumb. I know I had a lot of producers that like to buy the big 50 dose bottle thinking that they could vaccinate the spring and then save their leftovers for the fall run. That's probably stretching things a little bit too much. So that's just kind of a way that we can get this into a nutshell on how we can apply this vaccination product and protocols to really benefit. And as far as for your calves going to sell, the precondition or the protocols, most of them will say, vaccinated twice, wean for a minimum of 30, 45 days, bunk broke to feed and water. There are a lot of people who call their calves vaccinated or preconditioned, and they slip the vaccine into them as they load the calves up on the trailer or the week before. But that's not really doing anything except putting some money in the pharmaceutical company's pocket and being able to say, well, they were vaccinates. But it's not a true precondition program that way. So that's pretty much what I had. I'm trying to wrap up here because we were running right to 8:30, and we can open up for questions.
I did see some questions come through. What about giving a tetanus shot right after birth to the calf, then banned a day or two later? So I'm not sure which one of you wants to take that.
Well, yeah. So it really, it's the race is on. It's a race between the vaccine and the bug. And so tetanus happens when a Clostridial organism makes the tetanus toxin, and it's a toxin that binds to the neurotransmitters and causes that rigidity and that spastic response we're worried about, and it's always pretty much always fatal. And so if we can't get an immune response to the vaccine before the pathogen sets hold, and that happens after that scrotum sloughs. And so you've got an open wound and you've got Clostridial organisms in the environment, they get into that wound and they start making toxin. So it's doubtful that vaccine's it's going to have at least 2 weeks, probably more like 3 weeks. And our tetanus vaccines are primarily all killed. So you're probably looking at a booster on top of that. You're looking 8-9 weeks down the road before you can safely say I have tetanus protection on board. Now, if you're given that tetanus shot, if you're talking about antibodies like the antitoxins, well, as soon as you give that antitoxin, you've got antibodies on board, and that gives you a window of protection for that calf. And so that's that timing of how soon do I need my protection. That's where you make your decisions on which type, if I'm going to go with a vaccine or if I'm going to go with an antibody, an antitoxin. Dave, anything to add?
No, it's like you say, it just, like your one slide, it takes about 3 weeks for the immune system to respond to the initial challenge. And so it's a race. And also it's a race to catch the calf again. It's a race to keep the cow off, things of that nature too.
Doctors Dave and Rob, feedlots almost unanimously want calves double vaccinated and a modified live, and using modified live. Don't want killed vaccines at all. You want to comment on why that is?
Yeah, I mean the double vaccinations, they like them to have a couple of modified lives before they show up, and they want that to happen well in advance of getting on the trailer. And I think Dave addressed it earlier about that. There's a portion of a group of cattle, a small portion, but some, that just for some reason don't respond to that vaccine. Modified lives do the best job of eliciting an immune response, but even then, we just get a couple that just didn't read the book. And so if I come back around and give another one later, I'm covering my bases. And so the odds are that entire group will have mounted a pretty good immune response to at least one of those shots before they ever show up on the feedlot.
And the modified lives give a more robust response, is the current thoughts years ago when feedlots were just getting to looking at health protocols on arrival, and then started buying calves that were preconditioned. Back in my days out west, we also had the philosophy that if they came from certain parts of the country, didn't matter, they got vaccinated upon arrival within the first week, 10 days or so. So that's just kind of the mindset of the feed yards of, we know the modified lives do a better job, the more robust immune response, and that's what we're going to bank our calves' health on. Not only the group they're in, but also the calves on either side of that pen. So there could be another 5 pens worth of calves that could have to share a fence line or a corner with that set of calves coming in.
Yeah, they want trouble-free cattle. They don't want to have to do a lot of treating.
Very good. Well, we will have Dr. Dave and Dr. Rob hang around a little bit longer. If you think of any questions, feel free to type those in or unmute yourself and chat with them directly. But we'll hang around for a couple more minutes. But we want to thank you all again for joining.
For the participants. My question is, has anybody started preconditioning yet their calves? Has anybody started planning their preconditioning program for the fall? One of the nicest things, if you're buying your vaccine through a catalog, Valley Vet, Jeffers Vet Supply, places like that, they'll always add the ice packs in the shipping containers. Generally put them in a little styrofoam coolers and ship out. Don't throw away those coolers and don't throw away the ice packs, because you can reuse them the day that you go to precondition. Just keep your vaccine in that little cooler, and that keeps it, one, temperature close to what it should be stored at, and two, out of direct sunlight, which is very detrimental. UV light inactivates a lot of the vaccines. And three, the big one is it keeps the product clean. You know, hygiene is something we don't stress a lot about because we work with cattle on the backside that's generally kind of dirty. But keeping the vaccine, the vials clean, reduces the risk of, when you stick the needle through to pull out a dose, of adding a contaminant into the vial, which then you would inoculate all the other animals out of that vial. So just a little something to think about when you're getting ready to go vaccinate your calves or your cows this fall.
What about testing for BVD on the calves?
Oh, I think it's great. You can do an air notch. It's real fast, easy. Several clinics have that capability now. Private vet clinics, I know the diagnostic lab does. You can also pull blood and send that. Now, some buyers, some feed yards are looking for BVD PI negative cattle. And that's what the skin test, the air notch test is for, is that we're looking for that persistent infected calf, meaning that in utero, before the calf's, the fetus's immune system was operational. And Dr. Rob, chime in here. I forgot the day. It's what, 65, 120,
Yeah,
somewhere out there.
there's a range in there, but that's around that window.
And that's when the fetus's immune system wakes up, looks around and goes, okay, everything that I see right now is supposed to be here. And if the BVD virus is already inside the womb with the developing fetus, the fetus's immune system goes, hey, you're here, so you must be here, so I'll consider you normal. But that calf, as it develops, won't have any problems. It hits the grounds. It's going to shed that virus through all types of secretions. So not only 100 years ago when I got out of vet school, we were really smart guys. And we thought we could walk into a pen of sick cattle and pick out the BVD calf just by the way it looks. And we were patting ourselves on the back and how smart we were. Well, yep, those calves did have BVD, but they weren't the ones that were shedding the virus causing the problem. It was a really healthy looking calf that was the typhoid Mary in the group. Never got sick, never had problems. So that's what the ear notch does. It identifies that calf that's going to say, yep, this calf is going to shed BVD until the day it dies. And there's no vaccine you can give that particular persistently infected calf to eliminate the virus.
I'm
So
surprised they
that's,
haven't. I'm surprised
go
they
ahead,
haven't made their way into more preconditioning programs, because, I mean, putting a PI into a feedlot, that just wreaks all kinds of havoc. And so it would be, they would rather not have them. I'm just surprised we don't see more requirements for a BVD PI negative.
Yeah, it's coming down the road. A couple of my colleagues out west are pushing that more and more. And from the economics, it's going to be because right now the yards are not making a lot of money. And you get one PI calf that's in a pen, and it affects 6 pens. It's home pen and the 5 pens touching it. It's very costly. Unfortunately, right now, it's like preconditioning. You don't get rewarded for having a preconditioned calf. You just do not get discounted on the pricing.
And we really want to thank you all again for taking the time to join us tonight. And I hope that you picked up some new information to build off of your original BQA training. For those of you who maybe don't have your beef quality assurance certification, I would encourage you to go ahead and get that started. You can feel free to reach out to me. We are starting to get a couple of in-person trainings set up for this fall, or you can start your certification online at bqa.org. For those of you who are interested in looking to use this session as your continued education for your recertification, just to clarify, the email that I sent out, if you received one recently for recertification, or there is a form that I will send out as a follow-up, I will still need you to fill out that form in order to really count this as recertification. Your recertification form also includes a signature that you agree to the contract or the main bullet points of the Beef Quality Assurance Program. And so we need you to review that every 3 years and recommit to those standards. Also, if you're interested in pursuing level 2, there is a section of the form on there where your veterinarian will actually sign to document your relationship with your veterinarian, your VCPR. So if you have any questions about that, Catherine, feel free to reach out to me. You should all have my email, but I will send some of this information as well as a recording from tonight's session in a follow-up email. So thank you all again. I want to thank Dr. Rob and Dr. Dave and Dr. Baker for putting together this presentation and presenting to us tonight.